listing of the pages is only for the paper copy. What,
Okay.
it says 11 to 15, and so I was unable, I didn't keep looking.
Let's take a look. So, pumps, components, and maintenance, volume 1, module 3, pages 11 to 16. Let's look. So it's the section titled Centrifugal Pump Operation, page 105 of the PDF is where it starts. I'm glad it works, Kyle. Okay. So today we're going to look at a couple of videos on pump overhauling, pump tolerances, pump maintenance, just a couple of good videos. There's a list of them in Moodle. Let me get this up on the screen. Maybe. Yes. There you go. Just had to get it up. So if you look in Moodle, under today's session, there's this video with some kid in a component store who talks about in detail volutes and motors, and then there's this drawing analysis that goes through the parts and what each part does. I would not spend time on the positive displacement pump video unless you're just interested and have the time, but these are good ones. And this detailed maintenance video is also really good if you have the time. You know, I know you guys have a lot of stuff and it is a 42-minute video, but it is completely taking apart and servicing a pump. So if you're interested, I think that once you do the lab report and the lab on Wednesday, you'll get a lot of this information. And so I don't necessarily recommend duplicating it, but if you feel like you didn't get as much out of the lab as you want, this is a really good video to watch. We're going to be watching the two of the others today in class. So let's go ahead and jump into it. These are some training videos. They are not nuclear industry pumps, but they are large industrial facilities. And so I think the information is really good. And the guy's a little bit slow. He's older. So I hope you guys don't get bored, but it's good info. So let's go ahead and share. I don't know why the video ended. Let's do that. Okay.
Easily. First, he loosens the nuts with the wrench. When they're loose enough, he threads them almost to the end of the studs by hand. These pumps are supplied with glands that have either 2 or 4 studs. In this case, 4 studs are used. Next, the workman removes the impeller. To do this, he places an impeller wrench on the shaft. The shaft is rotated until the wrench strikes the workbench sharply. What happened was this. The impeller rotated with the shaft. But when the wrench stopped the shaft from rotating, the impeller tried to keep going a little. This caused the impeller to break loose from the shaft. It may take you several strikes of the wrench to break the impeller loose. Once the impeller is loose, it can be turned and removed by hand. With the impeller off the shaft, the workman puts it aside. He'll inspect it later on. The next piece to be removed is the end plate. The end plate is held in place by 2 cap screws, one on each side. The workman loosens them with a wrench. He places the screws in a plastic bag as they're removed. This protects them and keeps them from getting lost. If the plate can be installed in more than one way, be sure you match mark it to ensure it is reassembled properly.
Sometimes our bags will have radioactive markings because these might be contaminated.
With the cap screws out, the end plate is removed from the pump assembly. He takes care not to damage the shaft as he slides off the end plate. Any nicks or gouges could prevent the packing from forming a tight seal. The only piece now holding the shaft in place is the bearing end cap. The workman takes it off by removing the 4 cap screws which hold it in place. As before, the cap screws are loosened with a wrench. Then they're threaded off the rest of the way by hand. Again, he places the cap screws in a plastic bag for safekeeping. Once the cap screws are removed, the cover is taken off. The gaskets are also removed. The next step is to remove the deflector. The deflector is made of Teflon and should slide off easily. The workman takes care not to damage it as he removes it so it can be reused. This part is also bagged. When we left the workman, he was ready to remove the shaft and bearings. Before we rejoin him, let's take a look at how these parts fit together. The shaft is supported by 2 bearings. The bearings are press fit onto the shaft. A slinger ring is also pressed onto the shaft. Its purpose is to sling the oil as it rotates, forming an oil mist inside the bearing housing. This lubricates the bearings. The bearings are held on the shaft by a lock nut and washer. The lock nut is threaded onto the shaft and held in position by the washer. The first step is to bend up the lock tab on the washer so it clears the lock nut. To do this, the workman uses a punch and hammer. Several taps with the hammer may be required. Be careful not to damage the lock nut when you do this. Once the tab is clear of the lock nut, the workman places the impeller wrench on the shaft. He aligns the key on the wrench with the key slot of the shaft and slides the wrench on. This will hold the shaft steady while he uses a spanner wrench to loosen the lock nut. Notice that he holds the spanner wrench tightly on the nut to prevent it from slipping and rounding off the slots. When the lock nut is loose, he no longer needs the impeller wrench. The lock nut can now be rotated by hand. Don't spin the nut off. These are fine threads and may gall easily. After the lock nut is removed, the lock washer is free to come off. He places both the nut and washer in a plastic bag. The next step is to remove the snap ring. To do this, the workman bumps the shaft out a little ways. This gives him room enough to insert the snap ring pliers into the snap ring. Notice that the workman holds the ring in his free hand as it's removed. This keeps it from popping off. With the snap ring off, the workman removes the shims and stores them with the snap ring. These shims are used to set impeller clearance. The shaft is now free to be removed from the bearing housing. Take extreme care when removing the shaft and bearings. They fit in there snugly. As the bearings come free of their seat, there may be a tendency for the shaft to drop. Be sure you don't let this happen. If the shaft hit the housing, it could be damaged enough so that it would have to be refinished before it could be used again. The workman places the shaft on a set of roller V-blocks to keep the bearings off the workbench. He then covers the bearings to keep dirt from getting into them. Dirt in the bearings will damage them when they rotate. The coverings are taped on. This prevents them from being blown off or accidentally knocked off. With the bearings covered, the workman is ready to make out identification tags. These tags will identify the parts contained in each bag and will help the workman during reassembly. This is an especially good practice if a different workman were required to reassemble the pump.
And you would typically do this as you take the parts off and put them in a bag, not afterwards all at once.
And when is the best? Pulling apart a pump.
So this would be somebody who is an auxiliary system operator and is responsible for a particular pumping system. You would be usually there with somebody who is a pump maintenance technician to essentially be the assistant. So there would be somebody who is an expert in actual pump maintenance, but you would be there to make sure that they're labeling the correct parts, that they're not gouging your system, that they're doing these things correctly, so that your system expertise, like once that pump gets put back together, you have confidence that the pump is correct, so any other issues are in that system. So this is a good question. You will probably not be pump technicians. That's Evan's program, right? But understanding the precautions they have to take when they look at each part and how that's going to affect your pump. If you're an auxiliary system operator for a pumping system, you'll need to know that. Does that answer your question? Okay. That's why we watch a video on this instead of taking a whole class on pump maintenance.
This may take a little time, but it's worth it. It will save you time in the long run. The more complicated a pump or job is, the more difficult it becomes to identify the parts. With the parts tagged, you'll know exactly
the pumps in our lab to this level, right? Evan had to stop and leave the shaft alone and stuff. So this is kind of the extra that you didn't get to do hands-on.
what they are when you get ready to put them back together. With the tagging completed, the workman removes the gland nuts from the gland studs. Then the packing gland follower is removed. All the parts are bagged for safekeeping. Next, he's ready to remove the packing and seal cage. Since this is a new pump and the packing hasn't been compressed, the workman is able to pull it out by hand. If the packing were old and compressed, the end plate could be turned over and the packing pushed out.
Okay. So, as I mentioned, that is a lot of the pieces behind where we stopped taking apart the pumps when we did our lab 2 weeks ago, right? Because we didn't take apart the glands, we didn't take apart the packing, we didn't remove the shaft. So they have another video that covers the first part, similar to what we did, the casing and all that, and I didn't play that. But just gives you an idea of some of the extra pieces and the considerations when performing maintenance that you're going to have to be aware of. And after maintenance has been done, if your system is not functioning like it should, one of the first things you consider is that the maintenance was done incorrectly or that was put back together incorrectly, right? And so you have to know you have the potential to not have things tightened correctly. You can have the potential to not put your packing back correctly. You have the potential to gouge that shaft and have it now rotate incorrectly. So I kind of want you guys to see this part so you can put together then when you're operating that pump, what's going on behind the scenes. Okay.
The workman has completed disassembling, cleaning, and inspecting the pump.
Oh, can you guys hear that video online? Did I share it correctly?
Yeah, we hear it.
If any of the measurements had been out of specification, the necessary repairs would have been made. In this case, all measurements met the manufacturer's specifications, so the workman is ready to begin pump reassembly. The first step is to press the bearings back onto the
Let me see if I can get the
bearings back onto the shaft.
Volume button all turned up.
Next, he places the lock washer on the shaft.
So just briefly, he talked about all these measurements that are taken when you're doing this pump maintenance. So there's a series of different tolerances that the pump has to be able to meet. And that's why it can be credited for pumping a certain amount of water at a certain head, creating certain pressure, all these things that you need for your system, right? And the way the pump technicians are going to make sure that that pump is still capable of doing that is taking these tolerance measurements. So there's going to be a sheet that says this is what they have to be. That technician is going to make them, and then you as the system operator will know that your pump is capable of doing what it's in place to do. So if it's not, there's something wrong with the pump, right? It's still the correct pump. It still has all the parts it needs. They've been replaced and maintenance. Once you get that info, then we're going to do this reassembly.
I have a question.
Yeah.
It's kind of like what Lynette was saying. Say that you were the auxiliary and this was your pump and then you had a maintenance guy come in. Would you be there with them?
Someone from your operations crew will be, yes. A lot of time, maintenance is done either during outages, and you do that 24/7 as you go through the outage, or it's done during a lot of back shift, right? When you're not operating. So sometimes whoever the back shift operator is, that's actually the person who's going to be there when this maintenance is done. So if you work the day shift and you operate the system consistently, you may not be the person from the operations crew who's there during back shift when they do the maintenance, but someone from your team will be. Does that make sense?
He makes sure the tab fits properly in the keyway. This prevents the washer from turning. Then he threads the lock nut onto the shaft. He continues threading until it is hand tight. With that done, he places the impeller wrench on the shaft. This is to hold the shaft steady as the lock nut is tightened. The workman uses a spanner wrench to tighten the lock nut securely, holding the wrench tightly to prevent slippage and possible damage. With the lock nut tightened, the workman removes the impeller wrench. He then turns the shaft to find the tab on the lock washer, which is lined up properly with a key slot on the lock nut. Using a pin punch and hammer, he drives the tab over the nut, locking it into position. Next, a cone is threaded into the end of the shaft. This allows the seals to slide over the shaft easily, preventing them from being damaged. The shaft and bearings are now ready to be installed into the bearing housing. They must be eased into the housing. The bearings fit snugly, so be careful not to cock the shaft. That could jam the bearings, possibly causing damage. Care must be taken as the cone slides through the inboard oil seal. The oil seal has a press fit and is replaced each time the pump is disassembled. With the shaft in place, the workman installs the snap ring. He slides the ring over the shaft. Then he uses pliers to open the ring to allow it to slide over the bearing and into its slot. The shaft is then pushed forward as far as possible. This seats the snap ring against the bearing housing. Next, the deflector ring is installed. The workman slides it over the shaft and up against the inboard oil seal. If it's not positioned properly, it won't keep other fluids away from the oil seals. As a result, these fluids could enter the bearing housing and cause bearing damage. With the deflector in place, the workman places the gland follower on the shaft. Be sure it is put on so the gland throat faces away from the bearings, toward you. Next, he installs the end plate. The end plate must be put on with the gland seal hole at the top, and the cap screw bolt holes properly lined up. This is to allow the cap screws to be installed and threaded into the end plate. If it is possible to install the end plate on a pump you're working on in more than one way, match mark it before you remove it. That way you can make sure it goes back on the same way it came off. There's no gasket between the end plate and the bearing housing adapter. This is because these mating surfaces don't form a sealing surface. When the cap screws are hand tight, the workman uses a wrench and alternately tightens them evenly.
And that one is very important, the alternating tightening, because if you tighten down one side, you can actually crack across these casings. So watching for that, making sure that's inspected before the pump is put back in service is really important.
Next, he removes the cone on the end of the shaft. This allows the impeller to be installed. Take care when threading the impeller onto the shaft. As with most threaded fasteners, spinning it on may cause thread damage such as galling. If this occurs, the threads on both pieces would have to be repaired. You may have to hold the shaft to prevent it from turning. Once the impeller is hand tight, the workman slides the impeller wrench onto the shaft. Then he rotates the shaft with the wrench. As before, the wrench stops the shaft while the impeller tries to continue rotating. In this case, the impeller tightens as it rotates. The impeller will tighten itself further when the pump is run. With the impeller installed, the next step is to set the impeller clearance. But before the workman gets to that, I'd like you to stop the tape and review your text.
What?
How many years that guy's been dead?
The running clearance of the impeller. This clearance is very important because it affects the pumping characteristics of the pump. If there is insufficient clearance, the pump will pump below capacity, or it may not pump at all. Let's join the workman. Watch as he sets the running clearance of the impeller. Remember, the shaft has been pushed all the way into the bearing housing. The workman uses a feeler gauge to measure the clearance or distance between the impeller and the end plate. The feeler gauge should fit snugly, but not have to be forced into the space. You may have to try several combinations of blades. When the clearance has been determined with the feeler gauge, the workman then uses a micrometer to check the total thickness of the feeler gauge blades. Even though the feeler gauge blades have thickness measurements on them, you might have more blades than you realize. So by using a micrometer, you can be sure that your measurement is right. The clearance, which in this case is 92 thousandths, is recorded. Next, the workman checks the manufacturer's instruction manual. In the manual, he finds out that the clearance required for the service this pump will perform is 21 thousandths. This means that right now he's got too much clearance. He can reduce this clearance by adding shims.
And this will be in the procedure that we do, that you do these checks and you record the clearances. And most likely the maintenance techs will do that, and then you will probably be a verifier that checks that it occurred.
To find out how much shim thickness to add, he subtracted the two figures. This gave him the additional shim thickness required, 71 thousandths. Shims are supplied by the manufacturer in various thicknesses. The workman measures each shim thickness. Then he selects the combination that will add up to his desired thickness
And then adjust the impeller, is essentially what that video cut off. Okay. We're going to pull up one more. This is a little bit different base plate. We'll pump here.
peel in first.
啊，对对对对对对对。Yeah。知道的。哎，那个给他。
Marking it.
And I do have to say, his technique where he creates so much torque there, it's not ideal. That should be done slower on each one so that you don't tilt that plate across.
当然了，美国人他不可能给你一个东西，他要给你的。但是从理论上来讲，它是一套一样的，所以讲中国是一个没有符合。哪个学不懂的关键？懂？这人是不出来是不参加工作还是？
Let's just perfectly block the end of our video, huh? Okay. So I like that one because that's a little bit closer to the actual size pumps you're going to be looking at. They're not going to be little tiny ones like that first video. I haven't gotten a chance to talk to Evan since I was off campus. I do know he wants you guys in your 2 separate groups, and we're going to be doing some activity related to pump maintenance, but I'm not exactly sure what the lab is. So I'll find out. But just plan to meet in your groups in Evan's area on Wednesday. Any questions?
Would it be okay for me to off groups?
Because I don't have a partner now.
Oh, yeah.
And then there's a group of 3 in that group. So,
Yeah. That's totally fine.
so just confusing.
Yep, just come in the other one. In this class, next Monday, we do have our exam that will be primarily over pumps. There will be a little bit of the piping system and fluid flow, and I will have a review sheet. So on Wednesday, whatever group is doing lab, the other group can be in here and we'll review for the exam. This class, a lot of your grade is from the lab reports and the hands-on. So honestly, I expect the exams will be a little bit easier in this class than some of the others that are mainly theory and lecture, like thermo materials. But we'll have a little bit of a review on Wednesday. And then we'll start talking about valves. Any questions? Everybody online? You guys have any questions?
Nope, I'm good.
Okay. All right, guys. Then I will see you in this classroom for conduct of ops.